Daryl and Carol find themselves thrown straight into chaos, trapped on a street crawling with walkers. Buses, tall grass, every shadow hides another deadly threat. The question is, how will they make it out this time? Welcome to The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon, Season 3, just released in 2025. The story picks up right where the last season ended. Daryl and Carol had pushed through the underwater tunnel, where the air was thick with hallucinogenic bat guano. One by one, their companions either lost their minds or dropped dead, until only Daryl and Carol made it through, finally emerging on the shores of London. Both of them were still shaken. Carol saw visions of her daughter, long gone, while Daryl imagined fighting shoulder to shoulder with his brother. But after everything that happened in France, something inside Daryl had changed. He realized his life couldn't just be about running and fighting anymore. Maybe that's why he felt such a desperate pull to finally go home. Before they knew it, the two wandered deeper into the city. At the entrance stood a rusted warning sign: "No movement after dark. Violators will be shot on sight." But the guard tower was long overrun, now nothing but a husk. Ignoring the decay, they kept moving forward, admiring graffiti splashed across the walls as they made their way toward the heart of the city. Green vines had swallowed the streets, a clear sign that no humans had set foot here in a long time. Carol spotted a walker locked inside an old phone booth, while Daryl pointed ahead. Under the thick vines, more of them were hiding. A heavy sense of unease crept over them, and sure enough, it didn't take long before the empty streets started to flood with walkers. Daryl burned through his bolts in no time. Carol shoved open the door of a mobile home, only to find a steel gate blocking the staircase inside. Daryl threw his whole body into holding the walkers back, while Carol smashed through a glass window, reached around, and unlocked the gate just in time, seconds before the dead poured in. The two fought their way upstairs, floor by floor, until they reached the very top. Forcing open the largest room, they were met with a grim sight. The owner of the house, hanging in the living room, body twitching ever so slightly. He'd already turned. They didn't flinch, they'd seen worse, and went straight to searching for supplies. But then, the corpse snapped free of the rope around its neck. The walker lunged. Daryl reacted in an instant, dodging the ambush, snatching up a nearby ornament, and finishing off not one, but two walkers, clean and fast. In the back room, Carol heard the commotion and stepped out to check, only to run into a walker of her own. But for Carol, that was nothing. She grabbed a fire extinguisher and smashed it down, ending the threat instantly. The two pushed through a set of glass doors and stepped out onto the balcony. Peering over the edge, their stomachs sank. The street below was packed wall to wall with walkers, sealing off every possible escape. And just like that, the pair was trapped inside the high-rise for 2 whole days. The dead showed no sign of leaving. Supplies were running thin, and starvation was creeping in. Daryl decided their only shot was to force a breakout at dawn, then make it to the nearest port and find a boat back to America. Carol, less hopeful, quietly pulled out a single hot dog she'd been saving, a small comfort she planned to make her dinner. But before she could take a bite, a beam of light suddenly flashed through the window. Daryl rushed to the balcony. Across the street, someone in the opposite building was sending a signal. Excited, he grabbed a broken shard of mirror and angled it into the sunlight, flashing back his reply. That night, while Daryl was asleep, a noise from the roof jolted him awake. Both he and Carol crept to the balcony edge, tense and ready, only to be greeted by a strange man. His name was Julian, and unlike most survivors, he showed zero caution. Instead, he came bearing food, a rare luxury in this dead city. Overjoyed, Julian confessed he hadn't seen another living soul in ages. He even wondered if he might be the last survivor left in all of Britain. He explained that years ago, he and his friends tried to flee London on a sailboat. But when one of them was bitten mid-journey, the plan fell apart. Unable to sail alone, Julian was forced to stay behind, surviving in solitude ever since. Daryl and Carol exchanged a quiet look. After everything they'd been through, they weren't about to trust a stranger so easily. Outwardly, they chatted and smiled, but neither of them touched a drop of the wine he offered. Then Carol brought up their homeland. She told Julian they'd come from America, where loved ones were still waiting for their return. With sincerity, she invited him to join them. Hearing that, Julian's last bit of hesitation faded. He happily accepted, but first, he needed to gather his supplies. They agreed to meet the next morning at 10. With that, Julian climbed back over the balcony and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Daryl and Carol waited and waited, but Julian never showed. Just when they started thinking they'd been played, a thunderous chime rang out across the city. The sound of Big Ben echoed through the empty streets, and like moths to a flame, the dead began shambling toward the tower. Moments later, Julian appeared, hauling several bags of supplies. Turns out, he was the one who rang the bell, using the noise to lure the walkers away. But he wasn't in any rush to set sail. Instead, he looked them dead in the eye and gave a serious warning. He didn't want their journey poisoned by mistrust or betrayal. Julian had already guessed the truth. Carol and Daryl had no idea how to operate a sailboat. And at sea, even the smallest mistake could be fatal. Daryl, moved by Julian's sincerity, promised that once they were out on the water, he'd follow his lead without question. With the streets finally clear, Daryl picked up the weapon he'd dropped the night before, and together the three of them boarded the sailboat docked along the canal. As they drifted past Tower Bridge, they couldn't help but feel a knot in their chests. The ancient landmark was crumbling, yet still stood tall, and on its pillars, hordes of walkers stood roaring, almost as if bidding them farewell. Daryl never thought he'd be leaving London after only a few short days, but here he was, already watching the city fade behind him. But once the sailboat drifted into open waters, Daryl realized something unsettling. Julian wasn't exactly an expert sailor either. Without GPS or modern navigation, all they had were primitive methods to guide their way. Julian admitted, a little sheepishly, that if everything went smoothly, they'd reach the American coastline in about 2 weeks. That news lit a fire in Daryl's chest. After all, he'd been away from home for far too long. Over the next few days, Daryl grew certain of one thing. Julian was just a good-hearted, straightforward kid. And in a world like this, that kind of honesty was rare. But when night fell, Daryl couldn't help but think back to his time in France, especially young Laurent. He wondered if the boy had ever made it home safely. Carol, on the other hand, had already come to peace with her past. After what she'd seen in the tunnels, her obsession with her daughter was finally behind her. She let the memories drift away like smoke, and for the first time, looked forward to the future. Together, Daryl and Carol shared quiet hopes of going back to America, reuniting with friends, and maybe finding a new beginning. But fate wasn't on their side. On the horizon, Julian spotted thick storm clouds rolling their way. Before long, the sky broke open, and they were caught in a brutal storm. As the three scrambled to secure the sails, disaster struck. A mast swung loose and slammed into Julian, knocking him out cold. Carol fought against the raging wind to drag him into the cabin, but that left only 2 complete rookies at the helm. Now, it was up to Daryl and Carol alone to face the wrath of the storm. No one knew how long had passed before Daryl finally stirred awake. His head pounded, his vision swam, but he quickly realized the sailboat had already run aground on some unfamiliar beach. A few feet away, Carol lay half buried in the sand, whispering for help. She was dazed, her vision blurred from the impact. Her injuries looked serious. Then Daryl's heart skipped a beat. Julian. He rushed to the cabin, threw open the door, but inside, there was nothing. Empty. And that gnawing sense of dread immediately began to crawl its way into his gut. From the shore, Carol's voice cracked with alarm. Not far away stood a lone figure. From the silhouette, it could only be Julian. Relief lasted just a second, because as she drew closer, the truth hit hard. Julian had turned. Carol, barely able to move, was thrown to the ground in an instant. But before the undead could rip her apart, Daryl came barreling in. With one clean strike, he drove his blade straight through Julian's skull. They hadn't known him long, but Julian's honesty and good nature had already left a mark on them. Daryl's face was grim as he dragged the body toward the waves, letting the tide take him. Maybe, just maybe, the sea could give his spirit the peace this world never could. By the time night fell, the two of them stumbled across a cave near the shore. They built a small fire, its glow fighting back the darkness. And that's when Daryl turned his focus to Carol's wounds. She'd taken a blow to the head, but worse, an iron shard was lodged deep in her back. The wound already looked infected. There was no time to waste. Daryl sprinted back to the wreck, digging through the scattered supplies until he found a knife and a bottle of high-proof alcohol. Out here, there was no such thing as anesthesia. Carol clenched down on a stick between her teeth, her body rigid as Daryl pulled the shard of iron free. She didn't even make a sound. But that was only the first step. Whether she could survive the infection, that would depend entirely on fate. Later that night, Daryl walked alone to the shore, rinsing the blood from his hands. That's when a noise rose from the tree-line, shuffling, muffled voices. He froze. A group of figures emerged, each wearing grotesque masks as they crept closer. Daryl instantly stamped out the fire, then covered Carol's mouth, signaling her to stay silent. One of the masked riders came slowly toward the cave, his horse's hooves crunching over the rocks. Just when it seemed he was about to dismount and search inside, Another voice called from the distance. They discovered the stranded sailboat and the supplies inside. That night, Daryl and Carol stayed hidden, hearts pounding as the strangers picked their wreck clean. By morning, when Daryl crept back to check, the boat had been stripped bare. Every last bit of food, fuel, and medicine gone. With no other choice, the two of them set off inland. But Carol was fading fast. Her wound hadn't healed. In fact, the infection was getting worse. Not long into their march, they stumbled across a weathered, crumbling road sign. Carol squinted through her blurred vision, then whispered in disbelief. They were standing on Spain's infamous Coast of Death. America was still unimaginably far away. On their way through the woods, they noticed something strange. Dozens of walkers tangled in heavy fishing nets. That could only mean one thing. A powerful human group was operating nearby. Knowing Carol couldn't travel much further, Daryl found a rundown shack by the river. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. For now, this would have to do. But Carol's condition was getting worse. Her forehead was burning hot, and before long, she was mumbling nonsense in a fever dream. Daryl swallowed his fear and kept whispering in her ear, telling her not to give up, reminding her that they still had a home to go back to, a life worth fighting for. By the next morning, Carol finally opened her eyes, only to realize Daryl was nowhere in sight. From outside came the sound of rough men laughing, and her face instantly filled with dread. Meanwhile, Daryl was out in the woods, bow in hand, determined to bring back fresh food to help her recover. He managed to bag a rabbit, a small comfort in this nightmare. But just as he was heading back, the rumble of an engine made him freeze. A military jeep rolled past, packed with armed men shouting and laughing, completely unaware of Daryl hiding just a few feet away. When the coast was clear, he sprinted back to the hut, only to find it empty. Carol was gone. Daryl's voice broke the silence as he called her name again and again, panic cutting through every syllable. He couldn't help but grow anxious, remembering the armed men he had run into before. What he didn't know was that Carol had been drawn outside by the sound of cheerful laughter. She walked past the cabin and turned a corner, only to see a young couple playfully teasing each other. For a moment, her eyes softened. Even in the apocalypse, love still felt like something worth yearning for. Not long after, Daryl finally caught up to her. Carol smiled at him, but this iron-willed man ignored it completely. His eyes were fixed on a backpack lying on the stone steps. Maybe it held medicine for Carol's wounds. And if it did, Daryl was more than willing to play the role of a bandit. But before he could act, others got there first. A military truck pulled up, and 3 armed men climbed out. They spotted the supplies right away and carefully scanned the area, eventually discovering the hiding couple. The man tried to shield his girlfriend, but one heavy slap dropped him to the ground. Just as the raiders raised their guns to finish the job, a crossbow bolt came flying in. Daryl, like a hunter from the heavens, unleashed 3 perfect shots, each arrow dropping a target where he stood. But then, another figure scrambled out of the truck. Daryl wanted to wipe them all out, but it was already too late. That man ran faster than a rabbit, jumped back into the truck, and sped off into the distance before Daryl could even take aim. With no choice but to head back to the stream, Daryl found the couple checking on Carol's injuries. The girl, Tina, spoke up with concern. Her grandmother was a doctor, but her boyfriend looked uneasy. It turned out the town they came from didn't welcome outsiders, and the two of them had no intention of returning. Still, to show their gratitude, the boyfriend emptied his backpack and handed over all the herbs he had. Daryl wasn't satisfied. That wasn't nearly enough. He raised his pistol and made it clear, if Carol was going to get real treatment, they'd have to lead him straight to their town. So the group set off along a mountain road. After several kilometers, the outline of the town came into view. Robert, the boyfriend, wore a bitter look. They had struggled so hard to escape from this place, and now they were being forced back in. Daryl said nothing for a moment, then reminded Robert that the outside world wasn't much better. Robert gave a dry laugh and replied, "The town isn't so great either." Before long, they reached the town gates. There, guards were luring a pack of walkers behind the barricades, apparently their way of fending off intruders. One of the guards, Paz, immediately recognized his old friend returning with strangers. His expression hardened with suspicion. Tina quickly jumped in, explaining, "They saved me, and one of them is hurt." Reluctant but not wanting to argue, Paz finally gestured for the others to let them through. Daryl guided Carol into the heart of the settlement, and to his surprise, the place was far more prosperous than he expected. Still, the residents didn't exactly roll out a welcome mat. Everywhere they walked, suspicious eyes followed, filled with distrust toward outsiders. When they reached the central square, a curly-haired man appeared, flanked by several armed guards. They quickly surrounded the group, guns raised. Daryl didn't flinch. He drew his weapon and locked eyes with the leader, ready for a standoff. But before things could spiral out of control, Tina rushed forward and begged everyone to calm down. Only then did the tension begin to ease. It turned out the curly-haired man was the town's mayor, and Tina was his niece. That connection was the only reason Daryl and Carol weren't thrown out on the spot. Later, Tina's grandmother tended to Carol's wound and helped bring her fever down. But the moment treatment was finished, the mayor wasted no time giving his verdict. The strangers were to leave immediately. Daryl quickly protested. Carol was in no condition to keep traveling. At the very least, they needed one night to rest. But the mayor wouldn't budge. His order was final. That was when Robert's father, Antonio, finally spoke up. He reminded everyone that these outsiders had saved his child, and he was willing to take them in. After a moment of silence, the mayor reluctantly relented, granting Daryl and Carol 2 days inside the town. By then, the fever would hopefully break. Robert brought everyone back to his home. The place was modest, even a little run down, but he went out of his way to prepare a warm, quiet bedroom for Carol. Without meaning to, the gesture drew her and Robert a little closer. Meanwhile, in the living room, Robert was already plotting his next move. When he learned that Daryl's sailboat had run aground on the beach, he started hatching a plan. If he could gather some tools and patch it up, then maybe, just maybe, they could all leave this island behind. Daryl frowned. To him, this town looked stable enough. Why was Robert so desperate to escape? That was when Robert finally confessed. The lottery ceremony was coming, and when it did, there was a good chance he and Tina would be separated forever. Daryl stared at him, baffled. A lottery ceremony? What the hell was that supposed to mean? The next morning, Carol was already looking much better. She stepped outside and found Antonio preparing smoked meat for a fishing trip. From the look of it, he supported his children's dream of leaving too, and maybe that was the real reason he agreed to shelter Carol in the first place. But the moment felt short-lived. Paz, the stern guard from the gate, hurried over with urgent news. Our king is here on inspection. Antonio quickly explained to Daryl and Carol. This so-called king was the last surviving remnant of the Spanish royal bloodline. Once a year, he traveled from settlement to settlement, handing out supplies to his subjects. It was thanks to his authority that all these towns were bound together in alliance, and that fragile peace was barely holding. Just when Carol thought this so-called king wasn't all that bad, a middle-aged man suddenly broke from the crowd, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Give me back my daughter!" But before he could take another step, the guards swarmed him and dragged him away like an animal. Then, from the king's convoy, a young woman stepped down. Word was, she had been chosen as the king's next queen. But the moment Paz caught a glimpse of her face beneath the veil, her smile froze cold. It was Antonio who finally revealed the brutal truth to Daryl and Carol. Every single town under royal rule was forced to pay a terrible price. Each year, they had to tribute one young girl to the crown. In return, the king provided weapons and the illusion of protection. But the girls who were taken away, most were never seen again. Robert leaned in and whispered the part that hit hardest. This was the real reason they wanted to escape. Tina, his girlfriend, had been marked as one of the next offerings. As for the father who dared to demand his daughter back, he was sentenced to a cruel public punishment. The rest of the townsfolk just stood and watched in silence. Clearly, this wasn't the first time they'd witnessed such horror. Now Carol finally understood the weight of what they had stumbled into. She couldn't help but regret her earlier choice. If she and Daryl hadn't forced these kids back here, Robert and Tina might have already been free. Daryl, of course, stayed as hard as stone. To him, this wasn't their fight. But when he caught sight of Carol's troubled expression, he caved. Fine. If it came to that, he'd take the couple and lead them all the way to America. The very next morning, the whole town gathered together, preparing for the midday lottery. Smiles lit up nearly every face, because this yearly ritual promised one thing: another fragile year of peace. But for Tina and the few other young girls chosen as candidates, there was no joy. With the help of their families, they quietly prepared the strips of cloth that would decide their fate. The new queen-to-be hovered close by, whispering false comforts. She insisted that being chosen by the crown was an honor, something worth boasting about. But everyone there knew the truth. Her words were nothing more than a mask for something unspeakable. When the preparations were finished, the entire town crowded into the square. And that's when Daryl and Carol saw what this so-called lottery really was. It wasn't numbers. It wasn't stones. It was a game. A race of pigs. Each pig wore a strip of cloth tied around its neck, each cloth carrying the name of one girl. The pig that reached the finish line first would decide the year's sacrifice. The wooden track was packed with cheering townsfolk. And as the mayor gave the signal, the pigs burst forward, racing down the lane at full speed. Robert and Tina could barely breathe, their eyes locked on the finish line, praying over and over that fate would not call her name. And by some miracle, the winning strip did not belong to Tina. The two of them finally let out a shaky sigh of relief. But across the track, another girl's name had been chosen. Tears rolled down her face as she clung to her mother one last time. For Daryl and Carol, the sight was unbearable. Just then, a jeep rolled up to the edge of the square, and stepping out was none other than the bandit who had slipped through Daryl's fingers earlier. With the lottery over, the townsfolk turned their attention to the evening's festivities. A grand bonfire party was about to take place. Daryl, however, wasn't interested in dancing. His eyes kept drifting toward the strange wall of walkers surrounding the settlement. Curious, he struck up a conversation with the guard named Paz, but she didn't bother hiding her disdain. For weeks, she had been secretly planning Robert and Tina's escape, only for Daryl to drag them right back here. Daryl had no defense. All he could do was grab a bucket and quietly feed the pigs. And that's when he noticed Paz slipping into the shadows of the street, meeting someone in secret. To his surprise, it was the queen-to-be, Elena. Years ago, the two women had been lovers. But when Elena was chosen as tribute for the king, Paz thought she was gone forever. Now, fate had brought them face to face again, though under the cruelest of circumstances. Later, the mayor spotted Daryl with the pigs and waved him over warmly, inviting both him and Carol to join the banquet. That night, the square erupted with music and dancing. Villagers sang around the fire, while Daryl and Carol sat as honored guests at the mayor's own table. Curious about the outside world, the man leaned in and asked what things were like beyond their walls. Daryl didn't sugarcoat it. He told the truth, that most places had fallen apart, and even London itself was nearly wiped clean of people. But out of nowhere, Carol shifted the conversation. She praised the town for its prosperity, then casually dropped the remark that its only flaw was paying tribute to the king. Daryl's eyes went wide. He quickly tried to change the subject, afraid Carol might dig them both into a hole. But Carol wasn't done. She turned to the table and asked outright, "Why do you all willingly hand over your daughters to the crown? Even your own niece, Tina? Is a little food and a few weapons really worth the cost?" The air grew heavy, the party's cheer melting into silence. Sensing the tension, the would-be queen Elena stepped in. She insisted that this was all for the future of Spain, that the royal family offered these girls opportunities and even protection. She claimed she herself was living proof of that. But Carol didn't flinch. She shot back, "And what about your mother? Didn't her heart break when you were taken away?" The mayor finally stepped in, trying to smooth things over. He explained that these sacrifices were entirely voluntary, meant to secure lasting peace for their people. But Tina's grandmother was less diplomatic. Her voice carried sharp anger as she snapped at Carol, saying outsiders shouldn't meddle in affairs they don't understand. She reminded everyone that this system of tribute was born out of blood and sacrifice, the only way they'd survive this long. Realizing she wasn't going to change anyone's mind, Carol finally fell silent. She knew now, her way and theirs could never truly align. That's when Daryl noticed something. Across the firelit square, the bandit who escaped him earlier was staring right at him, this time with two friends at his side. Trouble had finally caught up. Daryl quietly slipped a knife from his belt, muttered an excuse, and walked away from the table. Just as he expected, the three men soon followed. They weren't here for drinks, they were here for payback. Meanwhile, the bonfire roared in the center of the square, painting everything in a deep red glow. The mayor leaned toward Carol, explaining that this ritual symbolized burning away the past to embrace a brighter future. Looking at his people dancing and laughing, he admitted how fragile this peace was and how far he was willing to go to preserve it. Back in the shadows, Daryl's pursuers split up. Two of them headed toward the outer wall. Perfect. Daryl tossed a stone into the dark, drawing their eyes, then lunged from the shadows. Steel clashed. Fists flew. In seconds, Daryl kicked one man clean over the wall. The second he gutted on the spot. Then Daryl peered over the ledge. The last bandit was clinging to the rocks for dear life, with a horde of snarling walkers waiting hungrily below. Daryl didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man's hand, sliced through his fingers, and watched as the bandit plunged straight into the feeding frenzy. And that wraps up episode 1 and 2 of Daryl Dixon Season 3. As expected, in a world like this, there's no such thing as a normal community. Carol, of all people, should have known better. She's been through hell and back, seen more horrors than most, so the idea of villages paying tribute for survival shouldn't surprise her. But for some reason, she suddenly grew sentimental here, and honestly, it feels a little off from her usual decisive, no-nonsense character. Oh, and here's a little tidbit the writers dropped. Apparently, Carol is going to have a romantic subplot with Antonio, the man we just met. Yeah, I can only offer a 3-minute moment of silence for poor Daryl. Anyway, that's all for today. If you enjoyed this recap, make sure to stick around. See you next time.